Luffy's so good with his devil fruit that it is basically the only power that he needs for the entire first half of the story, but then this happens. And he suddenly realizes that he needs top tier Haki similar to the likes of Shanks or even Roger so that he can actually survive in the new world. And then after seeing how overpowered he becomes using Haki in the second half of the story, I just couldn't stop wondering how strong Luffy could have been if he never ate his devil fruit at all and instead had trained only Haki ever since he was a kid. And this would most likely happen all the way back when Luffy first got his devil fruit, because let's assume that the red hair pirates don't completely lose track of, I don't know, the single most valuable devil fruit in the world. And so when hungry child Luffy is looking around for like a little snack to eat, Shanks actually keeps the treasure box with the devil fruit out of a small child's reach. And even though Kid Luffy is desperate to see what's inside that box, Shanks says no. So goodbye stretchy Luffy. But of course that's not all that's gonna be different, because even without his rubber powers, he's still the impulsive kid that we know and love. So when he insults those bandits, he's still going to get captured, taken out to sea, and has to be rescued by Shanks, because even though he can now swim, yeah, he's still no match for this monstrous seeking right here. And so now we get the first major twist, because when they get back to land, Luffy suddenly has a ton of questions about how Shanks actually managed to scare away that Sea King. And now, since this version of Luffy doesn't have his devil fruit, Shanks actually decides to show Luffy the very basics of Haki so that he can grow strong and protect himself. And of course, I'm talking specifically about armament and observation Haki here, since Luffy hasn't actually awakened his Conqueror's Haki quite yet. Although I do guess it's possible that Shanks could assume that Luffy has Conquerors because of his dad and grandpa, so he might even tell Luffy about all three powers right out of the gate. However, this is of course where we run into our first major debate, because when Shanks is about to depart in the original story, he gives Luffy the straw hat as a kind of symbol of his belief in the young boy that he can also become a strong pirate. At least that's what we always thought, but there's also the very real possibility that Shanks only tried to inspire Luffy in the first place because he ate this particular devil fruit. And that's of course because Luffy's devil fruit is extra special, and we can only assume it is required in order to actually become Joy Boy and find the One Piece, which Luffy just managed to achieve in Wano way later in the story. And so now the big question is, would Shanks still give up his hat if Luffy doesn't have this devil fruit? And I'm honestly not quite sure, but I do like to think that Luffy's personality would still inspire Shanks. Plus, it is still possible for Luffy to find Laugh Tale and become Pirate King technically without becoming Joy Boy. I mean, Roger did it. So let's just assume that Luffy still does get the hat, and Shanks even tells him that he might even tell him more about what was in that treasure chest when Luffy actually comes back and becomes a great pirate. Which now leaves us with the absolute crazy scenario of Luffy growing up training his Haki instead of his devil fruit powers. I mean, can you just imagine him running around the Goa Kingdom blasting off Haki punches? He would be insanely strong, and I honestly think that his grandfather Garp would actually be quite happy to see his grandson learning Haki so early that he might even decide to train Luffy personally occasionally, which ultimately means that Luffy's fighting style will be quite similar to that of Garp's, where he mainly fights with his fists, which I mean, Luffy does even with his rubber powers anyways. Although I do suppose there is technically still a chance that Luffy would eventually learn to use a weapon, since most Haki only powerhouses like Roger or Shanks still use a weapon as well, but then again, Garp here doesn't. But in fact, I actually think I have the perfect weapon for Haki Luffy to use, which we'll discuss a little bit later on. But first, Luffy would probably also awaken his Conqueror's Haki during this time growing up. Perhaps that time where he was captured by the bandits, or maybe even when Sabo died. Which means that by the time that Luffy's ready to start his pirate adventure, his Haki skills have leveled up from kind of noob to at least advanced, if not already master, and he's basically at the same level that he was right after the time skip. But we'll see very soon just how long he can actually survive without his devil fruit. And what you may not even realize though is that not having a devil fruit is actually going to save his life more than once in the East Blue, because while most of the enemies in this part of the story were fairly easy to beat, yes, you may have forgotten that Rubber Luffy almost drowned twice. Once he was thrown off the Baratier, and once when he dropped into the water like an anchor while fighting Arlong. And so yeah, both times he actually had to be saved by others, but that is no longer a problem at all because this version of Luffy has no restrictions with swimming, so defeating his enemies becomes a simple problem of smashing their faces with his Haki covered kicks and I guess punches as well. Plus, I mean, his observation Haki will help him dodge attacks pretty easily, like for example Arlong's spinning torpedo. I mean, he would even be able to probably break weapons using his Haki infused attacks as well. But of course, the maybe most insane part of Luffy's new abilities is that he would definitely be able to overcome his very first defeat against the Logia fruit using Captain Smoker. Because if you remember, Luffy only really struggled against opponents who actually had a Logia type devil fruit because, I mean, he could simply not hit them without either knowing their elemental weakness or, yeah, having Haki. But that's literally not a problem at this point in time because once Luffy figures out his Haki punches can actually hit Smoker, I don't think there is any way that the Marine Captain will be able to defeat Luffy. Which, when you think about it, might mean that his very first Haki might actually end up being a way higher heading into the Grand Line, which might actually be a serious problem a little bit later on. But at this point, I also think that we should mention that if Luffy knows so much about Haki, he most likely would also teach other members of the crew what he knows about Haki. Although, let's be honest, he's probably not the greatest teacher, and he might just tell them to figure it out on their own, kind of giving them like a rough explanation. But being around Luffy himself and seeing him use Haki abilities could mean that characters especially like Zoro and Sanji do figure out how to use Haki much earlier in the story. And as a result, a much needed early major power boost for the entire crew. Which of course takes us straight through the Alabasta saga to the eventual clash with the warlord Crocodile. And now, in the original story, Luffy had to fight Crocodile not once, not twice, 3 times, and there's no doubt that he would have died each time if it weren't for help from either other people and also a ton of luck. But once again, Haki is just going to completely change these fights because the ability to actually hit Logia fruit users is just so overpowered that Luffy should be able to deal heavy damage to Crocodile basically right away. However, that isn't to say that this fight would be super easy, especially since Luffy can only basically attack from close range since he can't stretch his body. But then again, Crocodile might also just be super surprised to find someone in this part of the world who can already use Haki, so really there's no doubt in my mind that Haki Luffy would find a way to win and save his friend Vivi's kingdom. Okay, so far so good for Haki Luffy, but let's see if he can actually survive against the strongest characters like the one coming up next. And that's because things are about to get impossibly difficult when the crew flies up to 𝙻𝚎𝚐𝚐. Because it's here, of course, that they come face to face with the lightning god Enel, and Luffy is going to need a massive power boost to actually take him down. So let me explain why. In case you forgot, the only way that Luffy was actually originally able to defeat Enel, who was a crazily overpowered fruit user, was because of his rubber body's natural immunity to electricity. In other words, Enel's insane main attacks were basically useless. But that advantage is now completely out of the window, so at this point Luffy is in quite serious danger of getting one-shotted by this electrical powerhouse. And yes, just like with Crocodile, Luffy can easily damage the Logia fruit user with his Haki, but the problem is actually getting close enough to Enel to do so. Because I mean, it doesn't matter how hard you punch if you get your heart fried before you ever get close enough to actually attack. But then again, 𝙻𝚎𝚐𝚐 also might be the perfect opportunity to introduce 2 new power-ups for Haki Luffy. Because one thing that we know for sure about Luffy is that he's basically a Haki prodigy, which means that he is extremely good at learning the basic and advanced techniques of Haki. So I do think after pushing his observation Haki to like the absolute absolute max when dodging Enel's lightning bolts, it's quite realistic for him to actually awaken advanced observation Haki during this fight. And doing so would let him see a few seconds into the future and give him a huge advantage dodging attacks and kind of getting close to Enel. But if that still isn't enough, Luffy also gains another huge bonus by not being a Devil Fruit user. That's because in the original story, we already saw that this Shandian warrior uses Sea Prism Stone to help him nearly kill Enel. And normally, Sea Prism Stone drains the power of any Devil Fruit user, but now that Luffy is Devil Fruit free, he could also somehow use these stones to gain an advantage against Enel. I mean, really, I can just imagine Usopp somehow making him some Sea Prison Stone brass knuckles or something so that his punches would be extra damaging to any Devil Fruit user, which, let's be real, is almost every single one of Luffy's fights. So with all of this put together, Haki Luffy with his knuckles should be able to take down Enel and save 𝙻𝚎𝚐𝚐 somehow. But of course, all of that is not actually going to be enough to save Haki Luffy from being completely overwhelmed by Admiral Aokiji. I mean, even in the original story, he was just completely washed by the Admiral's Ice Logia powers, and even though Haki Luffy in theory will probably land a few blows, still don't think that he even comes close to having a chance to win this fight, but we'll see if that's still the case the next time that Luffy actually fights an Admiral in basically just a minute. However, while they eventually survive that encounter with the first Admiral, Luffy's missing Devil Fruit will play a major role in the outcome of this next battle. Because after Robin was kidnapped by the world government secret agents from CP9, Luffy needed not one, but two massive power-ups to defeat the Leopard Man Rob Lucci. Those, of course, would be Gear 2, which gave him an incredible boost in strength and speed, plus Gear 3, which allowed Luffy to increase the size of his fists. But again, these upgrades are completely gone now. So what is Luffy going to do now? Well, there are a few options I think that could work here. First, Haki Luffy could just be so stupidly overpowered at this point that he beats Luffy even without needing any upgrades at all. And honestly, I think that is actually perfectly valid, but if in some case that doesn't satisfy you, then we can also consider that the entire crew is probably way stronger from seeing Luffy's Haki in action, so perhaps Zoro and Sanji also defeat their opponents much faster and easier, and they can all team up to kind of fight with their captain and take down Lucci. And so either way, I think it should be easier than ever for the crew to free Robin, escape Luffy's grandfather Garp, and then just breeze through Thriller Bark, let's be real, to reach 𝙬𝚐𝚐. However, this is where things are actually going to go absolutely crazy, and it all starts by you hitting that nice red subscribe button for more One Piece content just like this. But here in 𝙬𝚐𝚐 is actually where Haki Luffy will truly be tested for the very first time. And we could assume that Luffy's advanced observation Haki will actually help him make sure that this mermaid never gets kidnapped in the first place. However, that still takes a lot of fun out of this arc, so let's just imagine that Luffy still somehow punches a world noble, which still means that Admiral Kizaru and the cyborg pacifista still come to hunt them down. So here is, I think, where Haki Luffy is really going to shine, because if we assume that he's actually starting his journey with Haki skills as good as right after the time skip, then he should be able to crush the pacifista no problem, right? I mean, just look at what he did to this one before they left for Fishman Island. Plus, he's grown stronger through all of his fights, so honestly don't really see the pacifista as being all that big of a problem for any of the Straw Hats, really. Which does mean that we have to ask if they would still need to be separated by the warlord Bartholomew Kuma. I mean, I do think that Luffy at this point might put up a way better fight against Kizaru, but he still wouldn't be able to take him down alone. I mean, just read the manga right now. So if Rayleigh is there to hold off the Admiral, there's a pretty great chance that the crew would escape together somehow. On the other hand, if Kuma was really determined to send them all off across the world, there is really nothing that Luffy could do about it at all at this point. I mean, Haki isn't going to stop the awesome powers of Kuma's pushes, plus they wouldn't be able to go to Fishman Island quite yet without having a coded ship. So let's imagine that the story kind of follows the normal path and they all still get separated like they used to. And now, before we see the huge impact that Luffy's actually going to make at Marineford, we first have to look at his path getting to the Epic War, which would go pretty similarly to the original, I think. Although on the Island of Women, the pirate Empress Boa Hancock might fall in love right from the start because of Luffy's overwhelming conqueror's haki and of course kindness. But Impel Down on the other hand wouldn't change all that much. He still wouldn't be able to punch the venomous warden, so no big changes here I think. However, when Luffy finally does drop into Marineford, I could definitely see him actually charging straight into the war with his full conqueror's haki blazing. And can you just imagine the insanity of an entire battlefield of marines and pirates turning to see this madman dropping down from the sky? A bunch of the weaker enemies would probably just drop unconscious on the spot, and it might even force an admiral to come after Luffy right away because he's an unknown threat at this point. And speaking of the admirals, they are honestly some of the few characters who can actually stop Haki Luffy at this point. I mean, them plus Garp and the Fleet Admiral Sengoku, or the world's strongest swordsman Mihawk of course, are truly their only hope at this point. Because honestly, even someone like Doflamingo, I don't really think could stop this level of Haki Luffy with his current power level. So Luffy would definitely square off with someone like Kizaru, but instead of being easily sniped like in the original war, Luffy would put up a more than decent fight at this point because of his advanced observation and the fact that he can actually hit the light Logia fruit user, which as a result might mean that the Whitebeard pirates actually stand a way better chance of succeeding in rescuing Ace, because if Luffy is taking the attention off of an admiral all by himself, that means that the strongest allied pirates like the Emperor Whitebeard, Marco the Phoenix, and the escaped prisoners like Crocodile and Jinbei would get much closer to actually rescuing Ace. But sadly, just because Luffy is way stronger, that doesn't really mean that he's strong enough to win a one-on-one with an actual admiral, so let's imagine that he gets away and frees Ace just like in the original story. Hold on, wait, that just means we're gonna head straight to Donut Ace again, right? Aren't we? Let's find out. Because with Luffy's advanced observation haki, he now should be able to actually sense Admiral Akainu coming and at least dodge his fiery magma fist. But he honestly wouldn't be able to actually run away forever, and even if he is able to block a magma punch here or there, then it would most likely just send him flying all across the battlefield. And then with Whitebeard still suffering his normal heart attack, that unfortunately leaves Ace to once again getting killed by Akainu. Almost, Ace. You got so close this time. So with the major turning point once again over, let's assume that Shanks once again arrives, stops the war, and Luffy escapes like normal. Maybe, I guess he would still be knocked out from the shock, so I guess that doesn't change at all either. Which gives us one major question to ask. Would there still be the need for a time skip in this scenario? Because if you remember, Rayleigh came to train Luffy with the main goal of teaching him Haki, but since Luffy already is well on his way to being a true Haki master, is that even still necessary? Well, honestly, yeah. In our version of the story, the rest of the crew is still very much separated and they could definitely use time to train. Plus, I do think it would still be a huge waste for Luffy to not train with one of the few legitimate Haki masters in the world, so let's assume that Rayleigh does train Luffy for the normal time skip, but instead of learning basic Haki, Rayleigh puts him through a brutal training regimen that actually helps him master all advanced armament and possibly also advanced conquerors even, especially after everything he experienced during the war. Although I must admit that Luffy probably wouldn't master this last one quite yet fully, because as we know, Haki truly blooms mostly during intense battle. However, all of this means that after the time skip, Haki Luffy and the Straw Hats are way more overpowered for the rest of the new world, and honestly, I could just see this version of Luffy one-shotting and soloing the post-time skip opponents like the roided up Fishman, this Gas Man, and even Doflamingo, which basically just leaves Luffy to fight against the Emperor's Big Mom and Kaido, and during the Whole Cake Island arc, we could get one of the most interesting clashes against Big Mom's strongest son Katakuri. Because for much of the original fight, Katakuri didn't really respect Luffy as a fighter, and for very good reasons. Katakuri was clearly stronger with his superior armament Haki and future sight Haki, but in this version of the story, story, there is no doubt at all that Luffy has the upper hand. And so I would actually wonder if Katakuri would even go as far as to fight Luffy directly, or would they even clash at all? I mean, Luffy might just be able to kick him off the ship, which would allow the crew to just coup the burst away from the Sunny. Also, Luffy might end up having a way longer clash with Big Mom during this arc, but since his original goal was just go in, rescue Sanji, and go out, I don't really think that they just like have an all-out clash at this point quite yet. So on to Wano Kuni, and the biggest controversy yet maybe, because this is the scene of Luffy's highest test so far against the strongest creature in the world, Kaido. And honestly, I'm gonna drop a hot take here, because if Luffy is facing Kaido while already having a ton of experience with advanced armament Haki, future sight, and he understands the basic of advanced conquerors, then I truly don't see how Kaido can beat our Luffy here. Because Luffy was beat down so much during his original fight with Kaido, and it wasn't until he actually learned advanced conquerors that he was able to actually do any real damage to the King of the Beasts. And although Luffy even had to awaken Gear 5 to eventually beat the Oni Dragon, by this point he was already super exhausted. So if Luffy has basically his strongest abilities from the very start of the battle, I mean maybe even right after coming to Wano, then I think his insane willpower, durability, and overall Haki mastery will just lead him to defeat Kaido once and for all, way easier and faster than before. But, and this is a big but, that leaves us with a super important question, because without unlocking Gear 5, can Luffy still become Joy Boy and bring freedom to the world? Well, honestly, I think no. I mean, it was pretty clear in the original story that it was only after Luffy awakened his Devil Fruit and Gear 5 that this giant elephant officially recognized him as Joy Boy. So without his legendary Nika Devil Fruit, it just isn't possible, I think. But remember that little promise that Shanks made to Luffy at the start of this video? Let's discuss that more in just a moment, because from here, I think Luffy has a pretty clear, even path to finding Laugh Tale and becoming Pirate King. And we do know that he doesn't need to be Joy Boy to find Laugh Tale, since Roger was technically able to do it. So the question would be, could Luffy still use whatever treasure was left at Laugh Tale to go on to save the world without actually being Joy Boy? Well, we're not 100% sure, but this could also be the perfect time for Luffy and Shanks to meet up. And if Shanks has been holding on to the Nika fruit all this time, then he could very well offer to Luffy right now if he truly believes Luffy to be the right person to become Joy Boy. And while I don't even know if Haki Luffy at this point would all of a sudden even want to eat a devil fruit, and even if he did, it might take him some time to awaken it, but if this is a required step to save the world, I could see Luffy ending up doing it. Or who knows, maybe he just eats it again by accident, which, you know, might be a little bit disappointing since he came all this way with just Haki. But since he's already eating one devil fruit, why don't we even make it a little bit more crazy by giving him a second devil fruit as well, which, yeah, sounds completely wild, but can you imagine if Luffy had 2 devil fruits at the start of the story? So if you want to know which powers would best combine with his original fruit and how it would completely change his adventure, you can watch that video right here. Thank you very much to MainGrader 4434 who suggested this video. If you have any cool ideas for any what ifs, feel free to drop them in the comments. And yeah, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.